The blueprints were perfect. For Marcus Sterling, a real estate mogul with a god complex, the 5-acre plot on the edge of the valley was just a line on a spreadsheet, a minor obstacle to a billion-dollar legacy. But there was one problem. It wasn't a vacant lot. It was a home. And the man living inside, Arthur Penhaligon, wasn't moving. Marcus didn't see a human being, he saw a relic of a bygone era, an old veteran whose time had long since passed. With a smirk that dripped with condescension, Marcus stepped out of his luxury SUV, ready to force the issue. He had no idea he wasn't just dealing with a tenant. He was about to awaken a lion. The sunlight hit the chrome of Marcus Sterling's Range Rover, blindingly bright against the weathered wood of the small, modest farmhouse. Marcus adjusted his Italian silk tie, checked his reflection in the side mirror, and exhaled a puff of irritation. He wasn't a patient man. In the world of high-stakes development, time wasn't just money, it was dominance. And right now, he felt his dominance slipping away because of one stubborn, 78-year-old man who refused to answer his phone calls. The property was a jagged hole in his otherwise seamless master plan. He had secured the surrounding 10,000 acres, laid the foundations for a high-end gated community, and projected profits that would make his investors weep with joy. The only thing missing was the Penhaligon plot. Every time he looked at his maps, that little square of land felt like a middle finger pointed directly at his ego. Marcus pushed open the gate. The rusted iron hinge shrieked, a sound that made him grimace. He walked up the gravel path, his designer loafers crunching loudly, purposefully, as if he were trying to intimidate the very earth beneath him. He didn't knock. He wasn't the kind of person who waited for an invitation. He pounded on the door with the flat of his palm, the sound echoing hollowly through the small house. "Mr. Penhaligon." Marcus called out, his voice sharp and impatient. "We've been over this. The offer stands for another 48 hours. After that, it drops by 20%. Do you understand? You're losing money by the second." Silence greeted him. For a moment, Marcus considered just leaving. He had lawyers for this. He had people whose entire job was to make lives miserable until the target gave up and moved away. But there was something about the silence that bugged him. It wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of someone watching from the shadows. Finally, the door creaked open. Arthur stood there, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better decades and faded denim jeans. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like exactly what the neighborhood kids thought he was, a harmless, slightly eccentric grandfather who spent too much time tending to his rose bushes and talking to his old, liver-spotted Labrador. "Mr. Sterling," Arthur said, his voice gravelly and calm. He didn't invite Marcus inside. He didn't even step back to allow him room to enter. He just leaned against the doorframe, looking at the billionaire as if he were a fly buzzing around his head. "I'm done with the polite phone calls, Arthur," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're an intelligent man, or at least, I assume you are. Look around you. This house is rotting. The roof is sagging. You're sitting on a gold mine that's turning into a graveyard. Sell, take the check, and go move into one of those fancy senior living centers with the heated pools and the nursing staff that remembers to bring you your tea." Arthur blinked slowly. He looked past Marcus, his eyes wandering toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. "This house isn't rotting, Marcus. It's breathing. And I don't think you'd understand the difference." Marcus scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "Oh, save the poetic nonsense for the local newspaper. This is business. You have a sentimental attachment to a pile of sticks and termites. I have a responsibility to my shareholders. You have until Friday. Don't make me bring the demolition crew out here while you're still watching your soap operas." He turned on his heel, confident that the threat had landed. He didn't see the way Arthur's posture shifted. He didn't notice the sudden, absolute stillness that descended over the old man, a stillness that was far more dangerous than any shout. As Marcus walked back to his car, he was already composing the email to his legal team. He wanted an eviction notice on Arthur's table by Monday morning. He wanted the utilities cut. He wanted to break the man's spirit. He felt a surge of satisfaction, the kind he only got when he successfully crushed something smaller than him. He didn't know that every step he took was digging a hole for himself, one that no amount of money would be able to fill. Behind him, Arthur didn't reach for a phone to call a lawyer. He didn't panic. He simply stepped back into his home, walked to a trunk that hadn't been opened in years, and rested his hand on the brass lock. The stage was set, but the actors didn't know the script. By Monday morning, Marcus Sterling's arrogance had evolved into a full-scale tactical assault. He wasn't just playing hardball, he was playing dirty. He had authorized his team to leverage every minor municipal code violation in the book against Arthur. If the grass was 3 inches too high, the city sent a fine. If the exterior paint was peeling, a health inspector would show up, unannounced, at dawn. Marcus believed that if he could just squeeze hard enough, the man would eventually pop out like a cork, desperate to escape the mounting pressure. He sat in his glass-walled boardroom, overlooking the city, feeling like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. His assistant, a young man named Greg who lived in perpetual fear of Marcus's temper, laid a file on the desk. "He's not budging, sir," Greg muttered, glancing down at his shoes. "The city inspectors say he just pays the fines immediately. He doesn't even argue. He just writes a check from an old bank account and keeps tending to his garden." Marcus slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing through the sterile office. "Then find something else. I don't care if he's paying the fines. I want him uncomfortable. I want him to feel like the walls are closing in. Have the construction crews start working at 5 in the morning. Put the heavy machinery right against his fence line. Let him listen to the roar of excavators instead of his quiet morning coffee." The campaign of psychological warfare was relentless. Over the next week, the tranquility of the Penhaligon property was shattered. Massive yellow bulldozers rumbled to life before dawn, their diesel engines growling like hungry beasts. Dust coated everything: Arthur's rose bushes, his laundry, his windows. It was an environment designed to break a person's sanity, turning a peaceful sanctuary into a chaotic construction zone. Marcus would occasionally drive by, parking his car in the dust and watching the house. He expected to see a broken old man pacing his living room, hair disheveled, face etched with worry. Instead, he saw Arthur. The old man was rarely inside. He was outside, moving with a surprising, deliberate grace, working in his garden even as the ground shook from the heavy machinery nearby. He wore a pair of sturdy earplugs, but he never looked angry. He looked like a man who had weathered much worse storms than a few bulldozers. The local town began to notice. People who had lived in the valley for decades started talking. At the local diner, the topic of conversation wasn't the new luxury development, it was the old man versus the giant. "Have you seen him?" one local woman asked, stirring her coffee. "He's standing his ground. That developer is a shark, but Mr. Penhaligon. There's something about the way he carries himself. He doesn't look like a guy who's just holding on to a house because he's stubborn. He looks like a guy who's guarding something." The town started to rally behind Arthur, not necessarily because they liked the old man, he was, after all, a bit of a recluse, but because they despised Marcus Sterling. Marcus was the embodiment of everything they feared about the future: the gentrification, the loss of character, the arrogance of outsiders who thought they could buy their way into a community's soul. Marcus grew increasingly frustrated by the lack of surrender. He escalated again. He sent a legal notice claiming that the original land deed was ambiguous, hinting that he could tie Arthur up in litigation for years, draining his resources until he couldn't afford to eat, let alone fight for his home. He decided to make a public statement. He called a press conference at the construction site, inviting the local news cameras to capture the unveiling of the new community's second phase. He wanted the entire town to see him, the visionary, standing tall in front of the obsolete house that was blocking progress. He wanted to frame the narrative: he was the innovator, and Arthur was the obstructionist holding back prosperity for everyone. "This valley has incredible potential," Marcus told the reporters, gesturing expansively toward the rolling hills. "But we are being held hostage by outdated thinking. We want to bring jobs, we want to bring infrastructure, we want to bring the future. But some people are so anchored in the past that they'd rather see a ruin stand than allow progress to move forward. It's sad, really. It's a tragic waste of potential." Arthur stood on his porch, watching the cameras, the microphones, and the well-dressed reporters. He stood there for a long time, his arms crossed over his chest. He saw Marcus pointing at his home, his smile artificial and rehearsed. A flash of something cold passed through Arthur's eyes, not rage, but a chilling, clinical observation. He walked back inside and reached into the trunk. This time, he didn't just touch the lock. He clicked it open. Marcus, unaware of what was happening on the porch, turned to the cameras with a grin. And if the current owner refuses to listen to reason, well, we'll simply have to wait for time to run its course. After all, the clock is ticking for all of us. The townspeople watching from the edge of the property line grew silent. The air felt heavy, charged with an invisible electricity. They could sense it, the line had been crossed. Marcus hadn't just mocked the land, he had mocked the history buried within it. And as the sun hit its peak, they were about to realize exactly how much weight that history carried. The shift began in the quiet corners of the town. While Marcus Sterling celebrated his masterful PR stunt, the people of the valley were digging. It started with a whisper at the hardware store, then a conversation at the post office, and finally, a surge of activity at the local historical society. It seemed that in his rush to steamroll the past, Marcus had forgotten one crucial detail: small-town folks possess long memories, and they are incredibly protective of their own. A retired librarian named Mrs. Gable, who had spent 40 years cataloging the town's records, found herself staring at a faded newspaper clipping from 1968. It was a black-and-white photograph, grainy and obscured by age, but the face was unmistakable. She squinted, adjusting her spectacles, her breath hitching in her throat. She pulled a secondary file, a collection of military service commendations and local hero spotlights that had been archived and nearly forgotten. As she cross-referenced the names and the dates, her hands began to tremble. "Oh, goodness," she whispered to the empty room. "He didn't just live here. He carried us." News spread like wildfire, but it didn't travel through the press releases Marcus sent out. It moved through the grapevine, a digital and verbal network that money couldn't buy and arrogance couldn't penetrate. People who had once viewed Arthur as a quirky hermit began to look at his house differently. The rotting wood wasn't just wood anymore, it was a fortress that had held the secrets of a man who had stood in the path of actual fire, not just the metaphorical heat of a corporate boardroom. Marcus, meanwhile, was oblivious to the shifting tide. He was currently preoccupied with his next power play, a formal notice of eminent domain, which he had been lobbying the local council to approve. He spent his afternoons in expensive lunches with city officials, dangling promises of community enrichment funds and future tax revenue growth in front of their eyes. He was convinced that he had them in his pocket. He was a man who believed that every soul had a price, and if the price was high enough, the moral compass of the world would simply spin to face his direction. However, the council members were feeling the heat. They were receiving phone calls, not from corporate lobbyists, but from constituents. Real people. Parents of students who had learned about local history in school, veterans who recognized the look of a brother in arms, and neighbors who were tired of watching a bully harass a member of their community. The public sentiment was turning, and it was turning violently against the development project. One evening, Marcus decided to pay another visit to the property, intending to deliver the legal papers himself, a final, humiliating blow to Arthur's resolve. He pulled his Range Rover up to the gate, but this time, the gate was open. He stepped out, expecting the usual silence, but he heard something else. Music. It was coming from inside the house, a low, melodic hum of a record player, playing something haunting and orchestral. It wasn't the sound of a man hiding, it was the sound of a man who was waiting. Marcus felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck. He walked up the path, his bravado slightly dampened by the atmosphere of the evening. The air was cool, and the sky was a bruised purple, casting long, unsettling shadows across the yard. He reached the porch and knocked. This time, the door didn't just creak open. It was already slightly ajar. "Arthur?" Marcus called out, his voice lacking its usual, sharp bite. "I have the final notice. It's time to end this." There was no response, but the door swung wide under his touch. Marcus stepped into the foyer. He expected a dilapidated interior, peeling wallpaper, stained carpets, the smell of damp. Instead, he found order. Absolute, military-grade order. The floors were polished to a dull shine. The walls were lined with shelves holding books, all perfectly aligned by height and subject. And then, he saw them. They were mounted on a back wall, encased in glass, medals. Not the cheap, commemorative pins you buy at a souvenir shop. These were heavy, prestigious decorations, the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, the Legion of Merit. The dates were etched into the brass plates beneath them. They spanned a career that most people only read about in history books or saw in blockbuster films. Marcus stopped dead. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at the name engraved on the display case, Colonel Arthur Penhaligon. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had spent months mocking a man he thought was a nobody, only to realize he was staring at a living monument. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't the powerful one in this room. He was a child playing with toys, standing in the presence of someone who had seen the world burn and helped put it out. The front door clicked shut behind him, the sound sharp and final. "You like the decor, Mr. Sterling?" Arthur was standing in the shadows of the kitchen, his posture no longer the hunched, weary frame Marcus had expected. He stood straight, his shoulders square, his gaze piercing. In that moment, the years seemed to fall away from him, revealing the man who had commanded men in the most brutal theaters of war. I didn't know," Marcus stammered, his internal logic failing to grasp the gravity of the situation. "That is exactly the problem," Arthur said, stepping into the light. "You never take the time to know anything beyond the price tag. You look, but you never see." The air in the room felt thin, sucked dry by the weight of the realization. Marcus Sterling, a man who built his entire identity on the power of information and the ability to control narratives, found himself utterly voiceless. He looked from the medals to the man standing before him, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt a genuine, visceral fear. It wasn't the fear of losing money or a lawsuit, it was the terrifying realization that he had spent months attacking a man whose life story dwarfed his own existence. Arthur didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He simply walked toward the kitchen table, where a thick, leather-bound folder lay open. He gestured for Marcus to look. Marcus, moving with a robotic, detached compliance, stepped forward. He looked down at the documents, mission reports, commendations for valor, letters of thanks from foreign governments, and photos of a younger Arthur, looking out over a landscape that looked nothing like this peaceful valley. "You speak of progress, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice quiet but echoing with an authority that couldn't be faked. "You speak of bringing the future to this town. But you have no concept of what it costs to preserve the present. You think this land is a commodity because you haven't seen what happens when the land is taken from those who love it. You haven't seen a town leveled. You haven't had to choose which of your friends to carry home in a body bag." Marcus looked up, his face pale. "I had no idea. No one told me." "No one told you because you never asked," Arthur interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut through the silence. "You came here with a bulldozer and a checkbook. You didn't come to engage with a human being. You came to acquire an asset. And that, Mr. Sterling, is the fatal flaw in your entire life's philosophy." The sound of a vehicle approaching the driveway broke the tension. Headlights swept across the front window, followed by the sound of car doors slamming. It wasn't just one car, it was several. Marcus turned to the window, seeing a dozen silhouettes approaching the house. It was the neighbors, the town officials, and a local journalist he had invited to the press conference earlier that week. They had seen his car parked there for hours and, suspecting more intimidation, had come to stand watch. Arthur walked to the front door and opened it. The group stood there, hesitant, holding flashlights and lanterns against the darkness. They looked at Marcus, then at Arthur, and the shift in the room's energy was immediate. The townsfolk didn't see a helpless old man, they saw a leader. "Mr. Sterling," the journalist said, stepping forward, her microphone already out. "We heard you were here again. The town council has been receiving a lot of questions about your tactics. Is there something you'd like to share regarding your negotiations with Mr. Penhaligon?" Marcus looked at the group, the faces of the people he had dismissed as unproductive or stagnant. He saw the indignation in their eyes. The power dynamic had flipped completely. If he tried to force his way out, if he lashed out or used his status to dismiss them, he would be the villain in a story that would go viral by morning. His reputation, his brand, and his future in this region would be incinerated. He tried to muster his usual corporate charisma, but it felt hollow, like trying to start a fire with wet matches. "I was just discussing the property options," he said, his voice thin. Arthur stepped onto the porch behind him, towering over him, not physically, but through the sheer weight of his presence. "Mr. Sterling and I were just finishing our discussion on what is truly valuable," Arthur said, his voice steady. He was explaining to me how his project contributes to the community. I was explaining to him why some things are not for sale. The journalist turned her camera toward Arthur. "Mr. Penhaligon, there are rumors circulating that you have a distinguished service record. Would you care to comment on why you've chosen to keep that private?" Arthur smiled, a faint, weary expression. "Because the work I did wasn't for headlines. It was for the people standing behind you. And the work I'm doing now? It's for the same reason." The cheers that erupted from the neighbors weren't just for a war hero, they were for the victory of a human spirit over corporate greed. Marcus felt like he was shrinking. The camera lights, which he had once hoped would capture his triumph, were now recording his complete and total moral defeat. He was no longer the architect of the future, he was an intruder in a history he didn't understand. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He didn't make another threat. He simply walked to his car, feeling the eyes of the entire town on his back. He knew that the land was no longer in his reach. He knew that if he fought this, he would lose more than just the 5 acres. He would lose his legacy. As he drove away, the dust of his own construction site clouding his rearview mirror, he realized that for the first time, he was leaving something behind that he could never reclaim. His own sense of self-importance. Behind him, the town didn't disperse. They stayed. They brought out chairs, they lit a small fire, and they sat with Arthur. The old man's land had become a sanctuary for the entire community. The fallout was swift and absolute. Within 48 hours, the video of the encounter at the farmhouse had been uploaded, shared, and analyzed by millions. It wasn't just a local news story, it became a cultural phenomenon, a searing indictment of the arrogance that defines modern corporate expansion. Marcus Sterling, once the golden boy of the real estate world, found himself in a vacuum. His investors, terrified of the toxic association with the man who had tried to evict a decorated war hero, began pulling their funding. Projects were paused. Contracts were reviewed under the harsh light of public scrutiny. The narrative that Marcus had tried to curate, of himself as a visionary bringing progress to a stagnant land, had been completely dismantled, replaced by the image of a man cowering before the quiet, immovable resolve of a true protector. The development company's stock price didn't just dip, it plummeted. The board of directors held an emergency meeting, but they didn't need to vote. The writing was on the wall. Marcus Sterling was forced to step down as CEO, his career effectively over before he had even realized the extent of his mistake. He retreated into the anonymity of his high-rise penthouse, but the silence there was different now. It wasn't the silence of exclusivity, it was the silence of isolation. Every time he looked out his window, he didn't see a skyline he had helped build, he saw the 5-acre plot he had failed to conquer. Meanwhile, back in the valley, life had changed, though the farmhouse remained largely the same. Arthur Penhaligon didn't ask for recognition. He didn't seek out interviews, and he certainly didn't start a charity. He simply went back to his routine. But the community had changed around him. The town council, now hyper-aware of their constituency's values, passed a permanent protection order on the valley's historical sites, ensuring that no development could ever touch the land that had once been threatened. The Penhaligon plot became a protected historical landmark. Visitors came from all over, not to gawk at the house, but to stand in the space that had defined a line in the sand between cold, calculated greed and the deep-rooted connection of a person to their home. Arthur spent his afternoons sitting on his porch, his old Labrador dozing at his feet. People would stop by, not to demand, not to pressure, but to share stories. A young father would bring his son to hear about the history of the valley. A group of veterans would sit in silence with him, the shared understanding of their experiences creating a bridge of empathy that no words could replicate. They weren't there because of the medals on the wall, they were there because of the man who had earned them. One afternoon, a young developer, a protege of Marcus who had watched the entire debacle with a mixture of fear and fascination, stopped by the gate. He didn't walk up the path like Marcus had. He stood at the edge of the property, hesitant, waiting for an invitation. Arthur looked up from his book, his eyes sharp and observant. He gestured to the empty chair on the porch. The young man walked up slowly, his posture respectful, almost reverent. "I wanted to understand," the young man said, his voice quiet. "I wanted to know why he failed. I mean, he had the money. He had the legal team. He had the power. Why did he lose?" Arthur leaned back, looking out over the landscape that had remained unchanged despite the storms that had rolled through it. "He lost because he thought power was something you exercised over people," Arthur said. "He thought power was the ability to force your will onto the world and expect it to yield. He didn't understand that true power is the ability to endure. It's the ability to know who you are, what you stand for, and to remain steadfast when the world tries to move you." The young man listened, nodding slowly, absorbing the lesson. "He thought it was about the transaction," Arthur continued. "But everything that matters in this life is about the connection. He never connected with the land. He never connected with the people. He only connected with the numbers." The young man left that day with a different perspective on his own career, a lesson learned not from a business school textbook, but from the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen the world's most brutal realities and chosen to cultivate a garden instead. Years passed. The farmhouse eventually aged, but it never crumbled. It became a symbol of a different kind of progress, not the progress of steel and glass, but the progress of humanity, of empathy, and of integrity. Marcus Sterling became a footnote in history, a cautionary tale told in business schools about the dangers of losing one's soul in the pursuit of a profit margin. Arthur lived out his days in the peace of the valley. He never sought the spotlight, yet his story shone brighter than any skyscraper ever could. He proved that you don't need a massive PR team or a mountain of capital to change the world. Sometimes, all you need is a home, a history, and the courage to stand your ground when the world tells you to move. The story of the developer and the veteran became a local legend, a reminder that while empires may rise and fall, the strength of an individual's character is the only thing that truly endures. And in that valley, under the shade of the trees that Arthur had planted, that truth remained written in the very soil itself, an eternal, quiet testament to the victory of the human spirit.